Abram in the Battle of the Kings. It's the second story in the Abram-Lot trilogy. Remember, there's 3 stories that have to do with Abram and his nephew Lot. We looked at the first one last week. We're looking at the second one this week, and it'll be a few weeks before we get to the third one because there's a bit of an interlude in the account in Genesis. Aside from junior high boys, most people probably haven't read this story about the Battle of the Kings. I only say that because I remember it was one of my favorites when I was in Sunday school when I was a young boy, and yet it's a powerful, important, and interesting account. It's unique. It's the first time in the Pentateuchal narratives that the word war is used, and it's the first extensive description of a battle. That will happen a lot later on in the Old Testament, but it's the first time we have that. And it's unique because in its portrayal or its perspective of Abram the patriarch. Most of the time, whether it's Abram, Isaac, Jacob, or Joseph, the 4 main patriarchs in Genesis, most of the time they are certainly portrayed as men of peace. And yet here we say Abram is a man of war. And so that's unique as well. And one of the things we see just happening in the text is that Abraham is emerging after having received the covenant of God. Abram is emerging here in history as a leader among his cultural peers. He is emerging as an equal to the kings and chiefs around him. And that's one of the things that happens in the text. There are 3 themes that often work their way through the narratives of the Old Testament, particularly these Pentateuch or Genesis narratives. We talked a little bit about them last week. There's the theological themes, the moral themes, the Christological themes. Oftentimes, the emphasis is on the moral themes, and I think those are important, but that is not usually the primary intention, not the moral themes. What I mean by that is theological. What we're saying is, well, what's God like? What's God doing? What's going on with God in this text? A moral theme is more, well, what's man doing? What's happening? Good and bad? Are the things to imitate, things we should do or not do? And the Christological thing, I think, is pretty obvious. It's, where's Jesus in this text? How do we see Christ here? I just want to encourage you that the reason that Pastor Caleb mentioned that we'll be in there for the next 2 weeks is that we're going to completely ignore the Christological theme in this text. The reason we're going to do that is because next week it's going to be the entire center of the whole sermon. And you probably already, in hearing the story read or reading it yourself, recognize that name Melchizedek. It wasn't but a few years ago we went through the book of Hebrews and taught on this. And we want to revisit Melchizedek and the pointing to Jesus Christ in that in the sermon next week. So we're not going to deal with the Christological theme today. There are some moral qualities here that I think are important lessons. We see Abram's bravery and courage, his faith. That's good. But always in the text of Scripture, this is God's revelation. This is his self-revelation. The primary intention in the Scripture is for God to show himself to us. And that's why the theological theme becomes the most predominant theme in all of these sort of stories. While it is good for us to ask the question, should I act like Abram here? It is better for us to ask the question, how is God better than Abram here? That's a better approach. And we'll do both. So how do you preach a narrative like this? Well, you tell it like I think Moses intended. We're not going to read it again. Instead, we're going to tell the story of the battle of the 5 against 4 armies. These are the days of mighty warriors, tribal kings with deep lusts for power, for gold. 4 kings in the east. Amraphel of Shinar, Arioch of Elasar, Tidal of Goyim, and Kedor Laomer of Elam. His kingdom stretched further east than even this map can show. And it becomes very evident in history that Kedor Laomer becomes the mighty, invincible king of the east, the king of kings, rising above all these other nations. For 12, and the 5 kings of the west that we'll read about are Bera of Sodom, Birsha of Gomorrah, Shemember of Zeboim, and of the king of Bela, that is Zoar. For 12 years, the west suffered under the hand of the east, under Chedorlaomer. And in the 13th year, they rebelled from his oppressive authority over them. They refused to pay his tribute. They refused to be taxed by him. And so with a brutal show of force, Chedorlaomer and his 3 other kings, they bound together and they make the journey all the way up through the Fertile Crescent from these regions, working their way, gathering strength so they might launch an attack down on these rebellious 5 kings in the west. Their brutal campaign spares itself with no mercy. The Rephaim of the north. Rephaim, that's a word that's important. That word means giants. In fact, it will be the Rephaim that the nation of Israel will be afraid of, that will keep them from even possessing the land of promise. But the Rephaim of the north, they do not even stand a chance with invincible Chedorlaomer. He decimates them and continues his brutal march southward, down through the Shava Kiriathaim, the valley of the kings. And he brutalizes and he burns and he pillages and plunders. Even the Horites in their mountain of Seir are no match for him, as they fall one by one, and these 4 kings decimate and burn to the ground and destroy along the way. They go all the way down further south into the deserts of El Paran. As far south as you can get, they're out in the middle of nowhere. And then they slingshot around through Kadesh, another important place, because that's where the children of Israel wander for 40 years, waiting to get in. He pivots through Kadesh and hits Hazezon Tamar, which, interestingly, is where the kings of the west have chosen to make their final stand. And so in this valley of Siddim, the Salt Valley, the base of the Great Salt Sea, 4 against 5, we have the battle of the mighty kings. It's not much of a battle. Invincible Chedorlaomer decimates these 5 kings. Bera, Birsha, the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, and their allies. It's so devastating that the kings and all around run into the tar pits near En-Gedi. And what are the tar pits near En-Gedi? They are dangerous caves and false ground, and you fall in, and it's just they're willing to take their chances in the tar pits, and they don't make it, many of them. They are succumb to the elements. And the rest hide themselves in the caves of En-Gedi on the western shores of the Great Salt Sea. There's nothing left in the cities, no protections. And so with a laugh, Chedorlaomer, he takes everything. Men, women, children, goods. And he begins his return back north through the King's Highway, through the Valley of the Kings, away after having got his tribute in blood. But Chedorlaomer made a life-altering error. He didn't even know he was making the error when he made it. One of the insignificant citizens of Sodom just so happens to be the nephew of the servant of the Most High God. Lot, Abram's nephew, who when we last saw him was looking toward Sodom, now seems quite content to live in Sodom, which we previously read last week. The wickedness of Sodom and Gomorrah equaled the wickedness of humanity prior to the Great Flood. Lot is enslaved, perhaps drinking, celebrating, rejoicing, raping, and pillaging. These kings and their mighty armies head north. They've won after all. One of the slaves that was captured, he escapes from Chedorlaomer's army. And he runs with speed to the western side of the Jordan River, to a little town called Abram, to a man who is making his tents under the terebinth trees of Mamre. A man who had made some friends there, Mamre himself being one of those friends, and Mamre's brother, Eshcol and Aner. And this slave runs in, and I'm assuming that one of Abram's servants says, "You've got to hear this, Abram. You've got to hear what's going on." I wonder if Abram said that the kings were here and they decimated these cities. I know. Everybody knows about them. No, you don't understand. They got Lot. I imagine a flash came across Abram's eyes. Get the boys. 318, trained from childhood in his own house to be experts with weapons and tactics. 318, they saddle up, let's ride. And so Abram and his 318, and Eshcol and Mamre and Aner said, "Hey, we want in on this. We're with you." So they gather up theirs and they ride. And the Bedouins, the ones with tents under the oak trees, are going to go get back what's been taken from the invincible Chedorlaomer, who the Rephaim, remember, stood no chance. The giants stood no chance before. Abram the Hebrew, the text says. I like the ancient way of pronouncing that just because it has a sort of a Lord of the Rings ring to it. Abram the Habiru. That's how they used to pronounce it. Hebrew, Habiru, a word that was not used by Jewish people, by Israeli people. It's actually not an ethnic distinction. The word actually, Habiru, was a Canaanite word that meant slave, foreigner, marauder, pirate, that kind of idea. And this is the first time in the Scripture it designates the word Hebrew or Habiru. Because you see, it's going to be Abram the Habiru, the marauder, versus Chedorlaomer the invincible, the king of kings. But Chedorlaomer the invincible doesn't stand a chance with Abram the Habiru. So Abram saddles up and his men, and they head north up to Dan. And there they will encounter these mighty kings and their victorious armies. It's nighttime, so Abram divides the forces, and they ambush them. So resounding is the defeat that the text tells us, the story tells us, that Abram and his men pursued Chedorlaomer all the way to Damascus, Syria. That's way north of where our map shows us. So they didn't just attack. Once Chedorlaomer surrendered and gave up and began to run, Abram and his 318 boys said, "Nuh-uh, you're done. You'll never be here again." And they decimate the King of Kings, or so he thought he was. And so we have in our text the defeat by the Habiru, the nobody. On their way down, back from the north, as they came down to the valley of the kings, Abram and his victorious armies small armies, but victorious, they're met by a couple of people. So the first guy that meets him is the coward who finally decided to come out from the caves in En-Gedi. You know, the guy that had abandoned his entire city and all the women and children and everybody. Let Kedorlaomer have them, we're hiding. He comes out, Abram, welcome back. But another individual, another king, right next to the Valley of the Kings, who had kept himself aloof from the whole situation, he comes out to greet Abram as well. You've got Bera, the king of Sodom, who comes out to greet Abram, and you've got Melchizedek, the king of Salem, who comes out to greet Abram. Now, this is what is actually the heart of the story, focuses then in on this greeting, this meeting with these two kings. Half of the story told is this wonderful battle and victory, and the other half is this meeting in the Valley of the Kings that took place. Moses wants us to think of this meeting as the most important part of the story. Now, it's interesting. You could contrast these two kings in the text, and it's quite fascinating. Melchizedek, which means it's Malek and Tzadek, righteous king, or the king of righteousness is another way of saying that. The righteous king. He's king of a place called Salem. That's the Hebrew word shalom, peace. The king of peace. You've probably also heard of a city called Jerusalem. This is that same place. Now, it's not occupied yet by any Israeli people. It's occupied by this guy, Melchizedek. He's the king of it. But it's the place that becomes the center of God's universe. It's the city of peace, the peaceful place. Either prophetically or the name was given later, Sodom means burning, which in the third Lot Abram story, we'll learn a little more about the burning that is Sodom. So you have a contrast. You have the king of the city of peace coming out to greet Abram, and you've got the king of the city of burning coming out to greet Abram. Melchizedek brings a banquet. He brings out gifts for Abram, bread and wine. After all, will these men not be hungry and tired? Will they not need refreshment? And he brings out this bread and wine for them. Bread and wine, a very traditional meal given to people. It's not that it was unique or unusual, but it is also luxurious. If we could put it in a modern sense, he didn't bring them peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Okay? He brought them a banquet, is the way that phrase is used in Hebrew. So he brings out a banquet. However, the first thing that Sodom does when he comes and greets Abram, he says, "Give me my people." So the first words coming out of Melchizedek's mouth are, "Blessed be Abram." The first words coming out of Sodom's mouth are, "Give me." Now, it's not that that was an unfair request. I think it was a very fair request. They were his people, the ones that he'd hid from in the caves. But you just see a contrast there. And of course, then, the people and what they're doing themselves. Melchizedek is identified in our text as priest of God Most High. That's quite a title. Yes, for God Most High, but be the priest of God Most High? That's amazing. What is Bera known for? Well, he's known as overseeing the foulest, worst, most wicked city everywhere. You could say he's the priest of the damned. He's the one who is overseeing the burning city. So there's a contrast there. And the biggest contrast I think that you see is Abram's response to them. Abram responds to Melchizedek and his blessing by giving tithe to him. Abram, the one who's just won the battle, the one who's weary, the one who's lost, approaches Melchizedek and continues to give to him. Whereas his response to Sodom, we read it earlier, is from a thread to a sandal latch, I want nothing from you. He refused to take anything. He says, we've already eaten some stuff. We've already had some stuff on our way back. Obviously, that's the guy's right. And my brothers who came with me, Aner and Eshcol and Mamre, they can take what they want. But me, I want nothing from you, king of Sodom. Isn't that kind of a very expressive way of putting it that we read? From a thread to a sandal strap. Not one little thing do I want from you. So the rejection, the wholehearted and wholesale rejection that Abram has for the king of Sodom, and the warm embracing that he has for Melchizedek, king of righteousness, is very central in the text in contrasting these two kings. Significantly, I think that final contrast helps us see a little bit more about Abram. And as I said before, he's acting a little more patriarchal here than he has previously. But he will not lean on Sodom. He will not lean on Sodom. He will not trust in Sodom. He will not be enriched by Sodom. But he will give to Salem. But he will serve Salem. He will trust God to bless him. Neither war nor wicked kings will be how he is enriched. That is an act of faith and integrity, is it not? I think this answers the question that was previously asked, that we asked last week when we were looking at the first story in the Abram Lot trilogy. Will riches destroy Abram? We saw that affliction in Egypt and famine did not destroy him, but rather changed him. But remember what the Prince of Preachers said? Affliction has slain her thousands. Prosperity has slain her 10,000s. The dangers of prosperity and luxury, the dangers of winning. And yet Abram stands with faith in God. No. It answers the question, will the prosperity, will the advantages, will the success that he is experiencing move his gaze from the God who has covenanted with him? And the answer is no, it won't. So what are the lessons that we are supposed to take from this? What are we supposed to do with a story like this? Well, this is just a side note. First of all, this is cool, right? This is awesome. I was talking to my boys about this. The Bible is very fascinating. I think Lucas told me this week, he's like, that'd make a great movie. I'm like, yeah, except for Hollywood would all mess it up. But it's pretty fun, right? Pretty interesting. Wow, you see this. But I don't think we're supposed to just come from this and be like, that was fun. I wish I could have seen the slaughter. I don't think that's our point. But there are some application here. The first one I would suggest is to the first audience. In other words, remember, the Scripture is written not to us, but for us today. It's written to a specific people who would read it in that culture in that time. And then it's for us, meaning we then glean from it as well. So who were the first audience who would read this? Well, in the writing of Genesis, in the Pentateuch, we believe this was written probably toward the end of, after the Exodus, probably in the meantime, between the Exodus and the end of the wilderness wanderings, is probably when this is written. So who are the people that are reading this? They're the people who are in Kadesh. They're the people who know that have been delivered from Egypt, just like Abram just came out of Egypt in the last chapter. They've come out of Egypt. And now they're faced with the invincible Rephaim. They see the grapes of Eshcol, but they also see the giants, the Rephaim. And they don't want it. They don't believe they can do it. They don't believe that they can actually take what God has given to them. And I believe that there is an intentional purpose in Moses writing this text for that first audience, essentially saying to them, if Father Abram the Habiru can defeat invincible Kedorlaomer, who made nothing of the Rephaim, remember, why can't he do it now for you? If he could do it with one Haberu, what about thousands of them that have just come out of Egypt? Can he not do the same? By the way, that's where we get the word Haberu. That's most often written in outside biblical sources in something called the Amara tablets. It's kind of funny. That's really a lot of basically letters, that preserved letters, archaeological letters preserved, that are writing, a lot of them are writing from Canaanite cities and Canaanite kings, writing back to Egypt, asking to send help because of the Haberu who are marauding their cities. And what's funny about that is they never hear any reply from Egypt. And we kind of know why. Because they'd already lost their armies in the Red Sea, right? And so that's where actually the word Haberu finds its most oldest and ancient, is all these little Haberu running around. Look at them, coming out of Egypt, creating all these problems. We have ourselves settled already in here. And they're afraid, and they look back on this story of Abram, and they say, the mighty four kings of the east who decimated the kings you're now going to take could not stand in the face of the servant of the Most High, Abram the Haberu. He's with you. He'll take you in. He will fulfill what he promised to you, just like he did with Abram. And this wasn't even Abram possessing the land. This was simply because that guy messed with the wrong kid. That's all. But I think there's more than just the first audience lessons. There's things for us from this text. Obviously, as I said, the Christological, we will look at that next week and look at Hebrews 6 and 7. The moral lessons. Remember that these three stories, the trilogy, one of Moses' intention is to show the contrast between Abram and Lot. Abram being the quintessential wise man from Proverbs, and Lot being the fool from Proverbs. That's sort of how they're contrasted there. Lot actually isn't really in this story, is he? Yet he's actually the hinge that the whole thing hangs on. Yet we don't see anything about him. But there still is a contrast there. Lot, remember we looked at last week, he sought to secure his future, and now he is enslaved. Whereas Abram trusted God to secure his future, and now he's rescuing. And I think there is a simple lesson in that contrast. We must not allow the pragmatism of Sodom, of the world, to contaminate the principles of the word of Salem. Must not. And I think churches need to hear this loudly and clearly. We don't need to try to please Sodom. We have the blessing of Salem. Also, Abram is very heroic. Faith enables him to reject Sodom and embrace Salem. But I want to focus in on the theological lessons. Because Abram's heroics pale in comparison to God's sovereign provision. How did the Haberu defeat the invincible king? Melchizedek tells us how. Melchizedek tells us how it worked. And it wasn't because he got him on the drop on the ambush. And it wasn't because they had superior forces, because they didn't. And it wasn't because he divided his forces and split. That's not why, because Melchizedek tells us. He says this, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." Melchizedek tells us why Abram and his 318 young men could defeat Kedorlaomer the invincible, because God Most High delivered them into his hand. That's how. It's actually quite simple. God Most High, the first of the compound names of God to be found in the Hebrew book Genesis. El Elyon. Not a God of comparative degrees, not God higher, but God of superlative degree. God Most High. Not that there is a pantheon of deities. And God just so happens, the God of Abraham just so happens to be a little bit stronger than the God of Chedorlaomer. But there is only one God, the superlative, who is most high because he is called the possessor of heaven and earth. Remember in Genesis, heaven and earth, that's a euphemism for the universe, for everything. Why is he possessor of everything? He made everything. He sustains everything. He has all rights and authorities over everything and everyone. There is nothing that is beneath, nothing that is outside of his gaze and his hands. And there is no one. Abram the Habiru grabbed his 318 boys and he went up north to try to head them off, and he's doing all this work. But every step that Chedorlaomer made along the route, God Most High was marking and watching. God Most High delivered him into Abram's hands. He owns everyone and everything. He gives according to his wisdom and desires, according to the good counsel of his own will. And so the lesson is simple: react appropriately. Right? We ought to react appropriately to El Elyon and the description here in the text. Well, how did Abram react? I think that'd be a good kind of way to go down and say, oh, how should we react if we're to react appropriately? How did Abram react? Well, one, he received the blessing of the priest of the Most High God, and then he gave tithes of all that he had received. I think this is funny because what it sounds like in the text, and I don't know if this is entirely accurate, but it sounds like it to me, is that he gave him a tithes of all the spoils that they had taken from Chedorlaomer, which means some of his tithe that he gave was Sodom's stuff. He gave a tithe, 10th of everything, it says. So therefore, maybe the king of Sodom was a little irritated at that. I don't know. Now, this isn't a sermon on tithing. The principle that Abram responds with worship. That's how he responds to the Most High God. Not with seeking approval. Oh, look what I did, but let me give. Let me serve you, Melchizedek, the representative of the Most High God. Let me serve you. He reacts with humble worship. Furthermore, this is why he is empowered and enthralled to take nothing from the king of Sodom. You see, you don't need Sodom when you have Salem. You don't need it. Perhaps I'll put it another way. You don't need all that this world promises that will be burned up anyways when you have Jesus and New Jerusalem descending out of heaven. When you have the peace of God, you don't need the approval of the burning of men. You don't need it. You see, Abram doesn't reject Sodom because it wasn't enticing, because it wasn't good stuff. He rejected Sodom because he had bread and wine from the priest of Salem. Because he had the blessing of the priest of the Most High God, he didn't care for the applause of the king of Sodom. You see, we have a priest of the Most High God. We have a priest who was sent from El Elyon, who meets us when we are weary, when we are broken, when we are sinful. And he brings us bread and wine. I think he brings us a broken body and blood. And he says, blessed. You're blessed. You're blessed with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. You're blessed, you're adopted, you're chosen. In love, you've been predestined. You're redeemed, you're forgiven, you're justified. You're right with God. You're right with Most High. You have the peace of Salem because of the priest of the Most High God. You have this. And not only that, but soon Salem will come out of heaven, and the city of peace will descend on this earth. And it won't just be something we know we have by faith, but it'll be something we experience in practice, in touching, in feeling, in smelling, in seeing. And Abram was looking for that city, and so are we. You have all of that, beloved. You are blessed in every spiritual blessing. So why do you need the things of Sodom? So why do you need the approval of the culture around you? Why do you need all this stuff that soon is going to become ash? Why? Why do we need to enrich ourselves now when we have the riches of Salem? Why do we need to prove ourselves holy and righteous and good when we have the righteousness of our priest who has imputed that already to us? Can we not simply just worship? Can we not simply just respond and say, you are King of kings, truly, to the priest of Salem? In other words, better to lose those things that will burn up now and to have peace with the Most High God forever. There's an old song, simply says, take the world, but give me Jesus. That's the concept. Take the world, but give me Jesus. Redemption is better than reputation. The approval of Christ the King, the righteous King, is better than all the applause of Sodom's kings. See, when one apprehends that the righteous King of Salem has eternally blessed him and spread a banquet of grace before him, he has no need and loses delight in the treasures of this world. And so we can say with the Apostle Paul, who I'm sure Abram would agree, set your mind on things above, not on things on the earth. For you died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. And when Christ, who is our life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. Therefore, put to death your members which are on the earth. Put to death Sodom, fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. Because of these things, the wrath of God is coming upon the sons of disobedience, in which you yourselves once walked when you lived in them. And therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies. Put on Salem. Kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, bearing with one another, forgiving one another. If anyone have a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, so you also must do. But above all these things, put on love, which is the bond of perfection. And let the peace, Salem, of God rule in your hearts, to which you were also called in one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ, Melchizedek's blessing, the word of blessing, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. And whatever you do in word or in deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father, to El Elyon, Most High, through him. Because he is El Elyon, God Most High.